There's a good reason why God, with his mightiness, says, "My people perish due to lack of knowledge." The lack of knowledge has made a lot of people, particularly the black people, imprisoned. For this reason, education was invented, because Africa is where we had the first civilization. That was Egypt, and education started there. Building those pyramids, the methods of agriculture, the form of writing, the hieroglyphics form of writing. The world is whitewashed to believe that everything has been dissected into two categories, black and white. The world is colorful. The world is a rainbow. The world has many colors. Even God gave our eyes, the cells, the cones and the rods. And this is something that was invented by the imperialist. This is something that was invented by the slave master. A lot happened during the slave trade. A lot happened. It wasn't just taking people from here to here. Now there's this professor of an African-American descent. He's trying to explain the implications and the dangers of splitting the world into black and white. The dangers of Eurocentrism, because when Eurocentrism is born, Africanism is killed. Without further ado, I want us to continue listening to what the professor has to say. Bear in mind the idea of Eurocentrism. So let's dive in.
One of the interesting things about white historiography, this Eurocentric historiography, it hones in always on the things that separate us. They separate us from ourselves. They separate us from our ancestors, from our history, from our families. They divide us up into little fragments. And they never tell you about the unities in struggle that took place in history. And so my historiography hones in just on this point, because the logic of the situation is that if people were oppressed, like the Native Americans were and the African ancestors were, obviously they resisted the oppression. And obviously, as intelligent human beings, it occurred to them that by uniting against a common foe, they would have greater strength in the struggle. But the histories lie there waiting generation after generation. And then I pick up the books by Boyd Thatcher, who is a great admirer of Columbus. But in those books I find that in 1502, there is a rebellion, a major rebellion, in which blacks and Native Americans joined forces. 1492 to 1502. That's 10 years. And in that time begins a struggle. And you're going to find this uniting of the oppressed threading its way through the entire history for 5 centuries. And one of the great epics of the struggle took place in, of all places, in Florida. You know, we have black studies departments all over the country, and do you know, I have seen not one single piece about this to train our children, because the way you defeat someone, you defeat them in the mind first. That's why Garvey said, first you must change your way of thinking, and then peacefully carve up the weapons with which to fight. So they assault the mind. They tell you about rebellions that Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey and Posner. But if you notice, all of them were betrayed. They didn't win. And the one great insurgency that blacks fought in this country for over 130 years is one of the best kept secrets in black history. And it took place in Florida, and you read about it as the Seminole Wars. You've heard about that, haven't you? Seminole Wars? Do you know that there's no such thing as a Seminole? Seminole doesn't exist. Seminole was a Creek word for runways. And those slaves who escaped from the Carolinas and from Virginia down through what eventually became Georgia. Georgia became a state to block the movement of escaped slaves into Florida. Did you know that? That's how they set it up, as, in quotes, a free state. And there in Florida, the blacks were called Seminoles first. The black escapees who went into Florida, who were welcomed by the Native Americans there. And there you had some of the most interesting Native Americans in the entire hemisphere. There was a group called the Calusas, and the Tequestas, and the Apalaches, and even their enemies write about them with respect, because they were some really bad Native Americans. I mean, they... When Ponce de Leon came, and you know we have at the Exploratorium a film on Cabeza de Vaca, these who went with the Narvaez expedition, and interesting to see how they're going to do this film. How I learned about the resistance there in Florida is that you have to read a book by a half Native American who was related to the Inca kings. His name was Poma de Ayala. And he had oral testimony from soldiers who had actually fought in Florida. And when Ponce de Leon arrived there, he arrived like a conquistador. And I must tell you quickly how he arrived. It was the Taino pilots who showed him how to navigate those treacherous waters of the Bahamas. Bahama comes from Spanish Bahamar, the shallow sea. Then you anglicize it as Bahamas. So in there you can wreck your ships every second. And the Taino pilots, who were brilliant at navigation and at astronomy and at the science of looking at the motion of waves and judging the distances from land, which, you know, only recently the Smithsonian had some white scholar discover that those black folks in the Pacific were navigating the entire Pacific Ocean in their catamaran boats. And they could look at the motion of the waves and the wind and tell the distances from land in that big, vast Pacific. So this is what the Tainos taught to Ponce de Leon. And he got past that Bahama current and he got to Florida. He immediately fell on the Native Americans and began slaughtering them after they welcomed him. These murderous Spanish and genocidal Spaniards. And what the Calusas did, they waited for him to come back. And then they feted, wined and dined them for 4 days. And then they fell upon them and killed every single one. They left 6 alive, but barely alive. They wounded them so that the wound would work in enough time when they got back to Cuba to spread the word. Don't come back here. There's some serious folk here. And of course, they never learned, so they came back again. Ponce de Leon, we told, he went to look for the fountain of youth. They ended his search 6 days after he arrived in Cuba. He died from the wounds that the Calusas had put upon him. What that did for the Calusas, they learnt instantly the logistics of making special arrows that could neutralize the power of horses. They made special bows and arrows with special trajectories and force. and they would put their archers in the trees, and they could shoot an arrow right through the body of a horse. So when you read about how the Indians, the Indians in quote, were terrified of horses, the Calusas dealt with the horses. And then with armor, after killing the Ponce de Leon fellows in armor, they took the armor, they stuffed it with straw, they hung it up on a tree, and they found every weak spot through which their spears and arrows could go. So when the Spaniards came back, they were ready for them. They could take care of the armor, they could take care of the horses, and they were more brilliant tacticians in their own land. They could lure. So Allion goes next. And again, he went to a different part of the northern Florida coast. And when he was there, these Appalachians welcomed him, gave them food and drink. And then Allion invited about 300 of the Native Americans on the ships. And when they came aboard, they simply battened down the hatches and started taking them away as slaves. And every single one of them committed suicide before they got to Cuba, rather than face enslavement and this terrible act of treachery. And then Allion made the mistake of going back again. And this time they were ready for him. Once again they feted, wine and dine. And they said to him, Allion, why are you fighting for this distant monarch across the sea? We are warriors, and we would have more respect for you if you came looking out for yourself and your people here. We could share some things with you and show you some techniques of surviving here. Anyway, when the Calusas were finished with Allion, he and about 3 others managed to get back to Puerto Rico. For 100 years, the Native Americans in Florida kept the European settlers at bay. You hear about Herman de Soto, how de Soto discovered the Mississippi. De Soto was utterly and totally defeated by those Native Americans. I'm telling you this because the tradition of resistance filtered into the blacks who were coming in now into Florida, and who were going to write one of the great epic chapters of a struggle in the Columbian era. And you are told in the history books about 2 Seminole wars. The first, the blacks were called Seminoles. Then when the Creek Nation broke up and Sacagawea took his group over the border into Florida, these Creeks were called Seminoles. So there is no cohesive or logical Seminole. It was a word used to describe the people who had come into Florida from the north. And that alliance of the Native Americans and the Africans in Florida held in spite of every effort to break it. You heard about Osceola. Many black people call their children Osceola. Osceola married a black woman, and when he went to have talks with Thompson, General Thompson, at the Fort Gaines, slave catchers captured his wife, and his wife in the Seminole language was called Cochicher, which means morning dew. And this sister was a fighter, because the slave catcher who took her, the news came out after that she killed him and committed suicide. But Osceola swore that he would avenge this black woman's capture. And Thompson, the general, he and his men followed him for 2 years. And one night after Thompson had a good dinner and was coming out of his veranda, they filled him with about 14 shots from their rifles. And Osceola, after he fell, shouted, you know, "I remember the hour," he said. So we have to remember ours too, you see. No black woman was ever defended in a war in this hemisphere until Osceola fought. He fought, the first Seminole War was fought over that capture of Cochitier. And amongst these groups, you know, you know how we get the research about the Seminole Wars? You have to go to New England, into the libraries, and into the parish records. And there are letters from white soldiers who were fighting in Florida, who wrote home about what was happening. Because it was a felony for any journalist to mention that blacks were fighting in Florida. That's why you don't know about it. And that fight went on. And amongst the great leaders who emerged was Abraham. He is one of the great black leaders in this North American history. All of the whites who write about Abraham, even though they hate him, write about him with respect. Abraham was a brilliant man, a brilliant fighter, a brilliant tactician. He knew several languages, and he was one of the chief negotiators. See, while the Spanish owned Florida, Abraham knew that they could stay free. But when the United States bought Florida in 1819, they knew now that the whole might of the United States was going to be turned against them. And that's exactly what happened. By the late 1840s, 2/3 of all the United States armed forces were fighting against black and Seminole insurgents in Florida. 2/3. Over 50,000 troops. It's the greatest war in which the U.S. fought until Vietnam. And Abraham at one point called his followers together and said, "We are fighting for the liberation of all oppressed peoples in this hemisphere. We will never sign a treaty with our enemies." And the whole nation had to vote, and one faction voted that they would sign a treaty. And Abraham and Atlasa, or Tiger Cat he was called in the Coacochi, in the Seminole language, which means tiger cat. He was Abraham's counterpart among the Native Americans. And they left Florida when the whole, after defeating over and over again some of the mightiest of the armies the U.S. had mounted, including now Schlesinger, that historian, writes a biography of Jackson, Andrew Jackson, Stonewall Jackson. Do you know that the blacks in Florida wasted Jackson? He fought at Suwannee. There, that small town, Suwannee is a Seminole word, which means the river of reeds. And there, Atlasa and Abraham met Jackson's forces, and Abraham begged for the right to be the first to attack them. So he held the right wing, and they tore to pieces Jackson's forces. And he was frothing with rage. Here were blacks who he believed were inferior. And some of the tactics they used they played on Jackson's racism. They sent some blacks in front to look as though they were minstrels. They were chewing and playing banjo and jiving around. And so Jackson let his guard down, so he's coming on now to wipe these blacks off the face of the earth. And right there in those hammocks were waiting the highly trained troops of Abraham. And Jackson now, to take his revenge, this is not, you're not going to find that in your history book by Schlesinger, but this is a fact. He went to the settlement where they had left the women and children, and there he fell upon them and slaughtered them. And the history books tell you he won a great victory. And Abraham and his troops and his Seminole comrades had disappeared. And Jackson's advisors told him, if you want to be president of the United States, there are some really bad blacks here in Florida, and they will ruin your reputation to such a point you never make it to the presidency. So get out of here now. And he left, and he didn't come back. So then Abraham and Atlas took their whole communities to Oklahoma. And there once again they tried to trick them. They kept their arms, they never gave up their arms. And when they saw that once again they're being surrounded and tricked, I'm giving you a very encapsulated history, and I want you to go away feeling better. They fought from Oklahoma all the way into southern Mexico, into northern Mexico, in Coahuila, that border state, where there were about 3,000 black Maroons already to welcome them. They had escaped from the slavery in Texas and those border states. And Atlasa and Abraham lived there with their communities. Now the Texas legislature felt you couldn't have blacks like this, of such renowned fighters, living across the border, while the slave system is still rampant in this country. So these macho Texas Rangers now set out to go and finish off these blacks. The only reports I have of that is the Texas People, which says the 2 expeditions that went returned with their numbers greatly reduced. And Abraham died in bed, there in near a town called Santa Rosa on that Mexican border. And if you go there, I have been there, you can see the descendants of those black Seminoles. You can't hide the features and the blood. It shows. And there you see these larger folk who are ranchers are living there still. And they were given land and freedom by Juarez, the first Native American president of Mexico. He's a full-blooded Indian, Juarez. He gave to these black fighters because he knew they were such renowned fighters, they would prevent incursions from North America. So there was a quid pro quo thing. These are the things that we have to deal with in the Colombian era. Inside of that era, we have fought endless battles. And one of the things that we avoid in the history, and that we should learn from it, when Osceola fights for co-chair to make those who would dishonor our women pay for it, as Mao Zedong says, in blood.
Now, after listening to what the professor has to say, I think it's high time we discuss what is Eurocentrism and dissect this speech into its various parts that I find significant. The first part I found significant is when he mentioned the word Eurocentrism. So Eurocentrism is a worldview that centers Europe and Western civilization in historical, cultural, and social narratives, often marginalizing or neglecting the contribution and perspective of non-European societies. This bias has profound implications for the way history is taught, understood, and applied, with significant dangers for non-European societies. These dangers manifest in an erasure of cultural identities, perpetuation of inequalities, and distortion of global history and development of those countries which are non-European. You see, a story has two sides. Just like a coin has two sides, the heads and the tail, a story also has two sides. It can't always be about Eurocentrism. It can't always be about Jesus was white, or rather Jesus was this and that was coming. No. We have a story other than what is coming from Europe. We have the African perspective and we have the European perspective, as well as perspective from those other countries as well, which are not from Europe. What is this Eurocentrism and how did it start? Historical roots and manifestation of Eurocentrism is this. Eurocentrism has deep historical roots stemming from the colonial era when European powers dominated much of the world. During this time, European culture, language, and political systems were imposed on colonized regions, leading to a widespread belief in the superiority of European civilization. This belief was reinforced during education, literature, and media, perpetuating a narrative that placed Europe at the center of global progress and innovation. One of the key manifestations of Eurocentrism is in the field of history. History textbooks also often highlight European achievement while downplaying or ignoring the contribution of non-European societies. For example, the achievements of ancient civilization in Africa, Asia, and the Americas are often overshadowed by the emphasis of the Greek, Roman, and later European histories. This selective representation creates a skewed understanding of the historical development and fosters a sense of European superiority. The dangers Eurocentrism places on countries which are non-European is this: cultural erasure and identity loss, also as told by the professor. Eurocentrism can lead to the erosion of cultural identities among non-European societies. When European culture is portrayed as the standard, other cultures are often seen as inferior and as backward. The perception can result in a loss of cultural heritage, as people from non-European societies may feel pressured to adapt to European customs, language, and values. The diminishing of indigenous language and traditions is a direct consequence, leading to the disappearance of unique cultural identities and heritage. The second one is perpetuation of inequality. Once you've placed yourself that you are a European and you are higher and you are better than another person, what you are giving birth to is inequality. You understand? I think they believe that the end justifies the means. The Eurocentric worldview perpetuates global inequality by justifying the dominance of Western nations in political, economic, and cultural spheres. By valuing European achievements above those of other regions, Eurocentrism reinforces a global hierarchy where non-European societies are seen as less developed or less capable. This perception can influence international relations, trade policies, and economic development, often to the detriment of non-European countries. The third danger of Eurocentrism, according to my research and what I discovered, is this: distortion of global history. Eurocentrism distorts history by representing a one-sided narrative that emphasizes the European contribution while minimizing or ignoring those of other regions. This biased perspective can lead to misunderstanding of historical events and processes. For instance, the contribution of non-European civilizations to science, mathematics, and technology are often underrepresented in educational curricula. This distortion not only misrepresents its history, but also deprives students of a comprehensive understanding of the world's interconnected past. The fourth one would be impact on global development and knowledge production. In academics and scientific communities, Eurocentrism can limit the scope of research and knowledge production. The dominance of Western perceptions still in the fields can marginalize non-European voices and methodologies, leading to a lack of diversity in academic discourse. This hegemony can hinder the development of solutions to global problems, as non-European perspective and knowledge system are often excluded from the conversation. You've seen how Eurocentrism has really affected the growth of African Americans. But now I decided to widen it different from the African Americans, because we have other history, we have other societies apart from ourselves. And remember, Earth was made in a way that we depend on each other. We need each other to survive. Not a single thing. You see, we need things from other countries, and other countries need things from us. We need some kind of knowledge from them. They need some kind of knowledge from us. There is never an individual, or there is never an institution that is self-sufficient. I've looked upon the earth, heavens, and the waters. I've not seen such. Now, addressing Eurocentrism. Addressing the dangers of Eurocentrism requires a concerted effort to recognize and value the contribution of all cultures and societies. This involves inclusive education, promoting cultural diversity, decolonizing academia, global cooperation. Now, when I talk about inclusive education, what I mean is this. Educational system should adapt to a more inclusive curriculum that highlight the contribution of non-European civilization to global history and development. This can help foster a more balanced understanding of the world's past and present. Second one is promoting cultural diversity. Efforts can and should be made to celebrate and preserve the cultural identities of non-European societies. These include supporting indigenous languages, tradition, and cultural practices, and ensuring they are represented in the media and public discourse. The third one is decolonizing academia. Academia should strive to decolonize knowledge production by incorporating diverse perspectives and methodologies. This can involve supporting research from non-European scholars and integrating non-Western knowledge system into academic discourse. Fourth one would be global cooperation. International organizations and policies should work to promote equality and cooperation between nations, recognizing the value of diverse contribution to global progress. This can help to create a more equitable global order that represents and values all cultures and societies. This reminds me of something in Kenya, my country. The better you can speak English, people think you are knowledgeable. People think you are more attractive because you can speak better English. But remember, someone once said, eloquence of speech is not clarity of thought. It is best to have a clear thought, a good thought, than to have an eloquent speech, but nothing on your head. That is what I know. Africans, we have something on our head, but we can be diminished, we can be squeezed to believe we have nothing because we cannot speak a foreign language. That's how much we've been affected by this problem of Eurocentrism. How has Eurocentrism affected you? I want you to share your thoughts on the comment section. Now, to end this, Eurocentrism poses significant dangers to non-European countries, societies, by erasing cultural identities, perpetuating inequalities, and distorting global history. Addressing these dangers require a commitment to inclusivity, diversity, and cooperation in education, academia, and international relations. By recognizing and valuing the contribution of all cultures, we can work towards a more balanced and equitable understanding of the world. That is what I have to tell you, African. That is what I have to tell you. Are you an African American, black person, or anybody who can watch this video? I have viewers. Even I noticed I have some white viewers as well. Yes, you are welcomed. Welcome to EFK. If you enjoy what I do, if you enjoy my work, I'll advise you to subscribe. Subscribe, support me on Patreon. You can also give me a super thanks if you feel. Yeah. So thank you for watching this video. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll also have a deep critical analysis on the matters affecting African people. Yeah. We also do documentaries. Be sure to watch them.